Have you ever, like, walked out of a networking event, or maybe even just a really long, chaotic team meeting, and felt completely physically drained?
Oh, totally. Like, you just need to go sleep for a week.
Right. Or, maybe you've sat across from a manager in a performance review and been told yet again that you really need to speak up more if you want to be seen as leadership material.
Yeah, that classic piece of corporate feedback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because society constantly broadcasts this message that the loudest voice in the room wins. But what if the science and, honestly, a massive mountain of hard business data proves that completely wrong?
Well, I mean, we are incredibly conditioned to associate noise with competence, right?
Yeah.
We just assume the person who is talking the most in a meeting is, the one driving the most value.
Yeah, they're the go-getters.
Right. But when you start looking at the actual empirical data of where true innovation and sustainable leadership come from, that assumption just completely falls apart.
So today, we're going on a deep dive into a really fascinating stack of sources to figure out why. We're pulling from Susan Cain's groundbreaking book, Quiet. We've got neuro-psychological studies on brain chemistry. And we're looking at hard performance data from places like Wharton and Harvard.
It's a lot of great material.
It really is. And the mission for this deep dive is to uncover the biological reality of introversion. We want to show you why being quote-unquote quiet is actually a massive compounding advantage in the modern workplace.
Yeah, it really forces a total reevaluation of how we measure potential. But to do that properly, we really have to clear the deck on what introversion actually is.
Okay, let's unpack this, because right out of the gate, we know introversion isn't just a fancy word for being shy. I think we've largely moved past that myth, right?
Definitely, yeah.
Because they're very different things.
Right, because shyness is fundamentally about a fear of social judgment. It's anxiety. But introversion has nothing to do with fear. It's simply about how your brain responds to stimulation.
But the biology behind that stimulation, that is where things get wild.
It really is, because when we look at introversion and extroversion, we're looking at two entirely different ways the human nervous system processes the world, literally starting at the chemical level.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so if we want to understand why a really loud, chaotic environment energizes one person but completely exhausts another, we have to look at reward neurotransmitters.
Okay, so like dopamine.
Right. Let's take extroverts first. Their brains have a highly active dopamine reward network. Dopamine is, that motivational feel-good chemical that pushes us to seek out rewards, novelty, risk.
It's the classic hit of dopamine you get from like a notification on your phone or winning a game.
Precisely. But here's the catch. With extroverts, they actually have a less sensitive dopamine receptor network.
Wait, less sensitive? I would have thought it would be more.
You'd think so, right? But because their receptors are less sensitive, they require a massive amount of external stimulation. So social attention, fast-paced environments, taking risks. They need all of that just to get that baseline dopamine hit and feel energized.
Oh, interesting. So they have to work harder for the hit.
Exactly. Introverts, on the other hand, are highly sensitive to dopamine.
So if an introvert is highly sensitive, dropping them into like a really loud networking event or a chaotic open plan office is basically flooding their engine.
That's exactly it. It creates immediate neurological overload. Too much dopamine for an introvert feels incredibly overwhelming and exhausting. So instead of dopamine, the introverted brain actually prefers to run on a completely different neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine, okay.
Yeah, and it's tied to the parasympathetic nervous system. It brings a sense of pleasure and reward during deep, calm, internal reflection.
So if I'm getting this right, extroverts are essentially running on a dopamine sugar rush, while introverts are utilizing an acetylcholine slow-burning fuel.
I mean, that is a great analogy.
Yeah.
It's literally the difference between a dragster and a hybrid.
I like that.
And it's what makes you feel good when you're, say, reading a book or solving a complex problem alone or just having a really quiet, highly meaningful conversation with one close friend.
Right.
But the biological differences don't stop at neurochemistry. If we look at actual brain scans, introverts have a thicker prefrontal cortex compared to extroverts.
Oh, wow. And the prefrontal cortex, that's the executive functioning center, right?
Yes. It's the area responsible for complex decision-making, planning, and impulse control.
Okay.
Because of this thicker gray matter, introverts are biologically predisposed to be far less impulsive. They run complex internal simulations of, potential outcomes before they take action.
So practically, what does this look like in a meeting? Like, if I have a quiet colleague, who always pauses for, I don't know, 5 seconds before answering a direct question. My instinct, or maybe the corporate instinct, is that they're unprepared or they lack confidence. What's actually happening in their head?
They're actually accessing a completely different type of memory. So studies show extroverts rely heavily on working memory.
Which is like the short-term RAM of the brain.
Exactly. It allows for incredibly quick retrieval and thinking on your feet. It's the biological driver behind that classic thinking out loud trait.
Right, the people who figure out what they're saying while they're saying it.
Yeah. But introverts rely much more heavily on long-term memory. It literally takes a fraction of a second longer for the brain's electrical signals to travel into that deep long-term storage and retrieve the information.
Oh, wow. So they aren't lost. They're literally digging into a deeper mental archive.
Precisely. And the trade-off for that slight delay is that the response they eventually give is usually deeper, more connected to past experiences, and highly synthesized.
That makes so much sense.
And you can't just train yourself out of this processing style. The sources we looked at point to longitudinal studies on infants.
Wait, really? Infants?
Yeah. Researchers can observe these traits in babies. Babies with highly sensitive nervous systems who react really strongly and get overwhelmed by new stimuli are the ones statistically most likely to develop into introverts. It's an innate biological baseline.
Which raises a massive contradiction, honestly. If the introverted brain is so biologically optimized for deep thought, strategic planning, complex problem solving, why on earth is the modern workplace designed to be so incredibly loud, distracting, and chaotic?
It's a great question. And to understand that, Susan Cain's research takes us back to a major historical shift in Western culture right at the turn of the 20th century.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah. Before the 1900s, society largely operated in what historians call a culture of character. You lived in a small town, you worked alongside the same people your whole life, and society valued inner virtue, duty, quiet integrity.
Because people knew your character over time.
Right.
But then industrialization hits. People flood into these massive cities. You are suddenly surrounded by thousands of strangers every single day.
And in a city of strangers, first impressions become the primary currency. We completely shifted to a culture of personality. This era was driven by the archetype of the charismatic salesman. With the rise of big business being magnetic, dominant, visibly enthusiastic, those were suddenly the ultimate virtues.
Oh, man. It's the origin story of the hustle culture influencer.
Yeah.
The guy filming himself yelling motivational speeches from the front seat of his car.
Yes, that is the modern extreme of it. But this shift birthed what Cain calls the extrovert ideal. It's this baseline assumption that the ideal employee, the ideal leader, is highly gregarious, alpha, comfortable in the spotlight.
Right.
And that extrovert ideal led directly to what we now call new groupthink, this really flawed institutional belief that all creativity and innovation must come from extreme constant collaboration.
Oh, wow. Here's where it gets really interesting for anyone currently sitting in a cubicle. Are companies actually suffocating their best ideas by forcing everyone into these noisy, open concept rooms where the loudest, not the best idea wins?
The data on open plan offices is absolutely brutal. I mean, studies show they reduce productivity, they impair memory, they increase employee turnover, and they even lead to higher rates of illness.
That's crazy.
And yet, we've shrunk the amount of space allotted to each employee by roughly 60% since the 1970s, all in the name of collaboration.
But wait, why does noise impair memory specifically? Like, if I'm an introvert, why can't I just put on some noise-canceling headphones and power through?
Because human brains are biologically hardwired to process background chatter as a potential social cue or even a threat. Working memory has a strictly limited cognitive load.
Okay.
So when you're trying to solve a complex problem, but your brain is subconsciously trying to parse the half conversation happening 2 desks over, it literally steals processing power away from the task at hand. You are constantly dealing with micro-interruptions.
And it gets even worse when management tries to force collaboration through group brainstorming. I mean, I think everyone has sat in a room with a whiteboard while someone shouts, "There are no bad ideas."
Oh, the worst.
But decades of data show that group brainstorming is statistically far less effective than individual brainstorming.
It's true. It fails on 2 distinct psychological fronts. First is production blocking. In a group setting, only one person can speak at a time.
Right.
So if you have an idea but someone else is talking, you have to hold that idea in your working memory. That cognitive effort prevents you from generating any new ideas. Or worse, the conversation moves on and your idea is lost entirely.
Wow. You literally block the brain's production line just by waiting your turn.
Exactly. The second factor is evaluation apprehension. No matter how many times a manager says there are no bad ideas,
Mm,
humans have an innate psychological fear of looking stupid in front of their peers.
of course.
This causes people to subconsciously self-censor their most original out-of-the-box thoughts. They only offer the safe ideas.
So true innovation usually requires solitude. I mean, our sources bring up deliberate practice.
Mhm.
The famous 10,000-hour rule research by Anders Ericsson showed that solo practice is one of the strongest predictors of skill across almost every discipline. You need quiet to systematically address your weaknesses and let your mind wander into actual creative problem solving without the fear of judgment.
Absolutely. And this societal bias toward loudness really peaks when we look at who gets promoted into leadership. Currently, 96% of managers and executives display extroverted traits.
96%. That's almost everyone.
It is. There is a massive promotion bias toward the people who speak the most, not necessarily the people with the best ideas.
But when we measure the actual performance data of those leaders, a shocking paradox emerges. Like, the CEO Genome Project analyzed 17,000 executive assessments over a decade. And they found that while boards of directors are easily charmed by charismatic extroverts during the hiring process, it's actually the introverted CEOs who are more likely to exceed the expectations of their boards and investors.
Which ties directly back to that thicker prefrontal cortex we talked about. Introverted leaders tend to rely on decisive, methodical planning. They aren't seeking the dopamine hit of a massive, impulsive acquisition or a flashy pivot. They look at the long-term data.
And the dynamics of how they manage their teams are even more fascinating. Let's look at the Wharton study by Adam Grant involving 130 pizza franchises. He wanted to see how a leader's personality affected actual store profits.
Yeah, this study is wild. Grant found that extroverted leaders generated 16% higher profits when managing passive teams.
Passive meaning teams that just needed clear, energetic direction to execute standard tasks.
Exactly, they just needed motivation. But what happens when an extrovert manages a proactive team? A team of employees who actually offer their own ideas for improving the business.
Right.
In those stores, extrovert-led locations saw a 14% drop in profit.
A 14% drop. How does that even happen? What were the extroverted managers actually doing to cause that kind of loss?
Basically, they felt threatened. Extroverted leaders naturally want to command the center of attention. When proactive employees challenge that dynamic by bringing their own ideas to the table, the extroverted managers subconsciously shut them down. They would interrupt, dismiss ideas too quickly, or use dismissive body language. The employees realized their initiative wasn't welcome, so they just stopped trying.
But introverted leaders excelled with those proactive teams.
Right, because introverts are naturally better listeners, and they lack that ego-driven need for the spotlight. They act as an anchor. They create the psychological safety for proactivity to thrive.
Yeah.
In a related lab study with college students folding T-shirts, introverted leaders led proactive teams to fold 28% more shirts. They didn't try to outshine their team, they just facilitated the team's best ideas.
So think about your own manager for a second. Do they command the room or do they curate the room? Because the data shows that difference could be costing companies 14% of their bottom line.
It's significant.
And we aren't saying extroverts are bad leaders, right? We're saying their leadership style actively clashes with employees who want to take initiative, whereas a quiet leader creates the space for it.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this extends far beyond corporate profits. In high-stakes environments, quiet leadership literally saves lives. We have a source from Leverage Safety focusing on the oil and gas industry.
Right, the offshore rig.
Yeah. In highly volatile, complex environments like an offshore drilling rig, quiet professionals act as a critical early detection system.
Let's talk about that specific example, the offshore rig safety officer.
Yeah, so while everyone else was yelling over the noise of the machinery, totally focused on immediate, fast-paced tasks, she was quietly, deeply observing. And she noticed a subtle, recurring deviation in how workers were manually handling heavy loads.
Something a loud, fast-paced person would miss.
Exactly. This wasn't something you'd catch on a standard clipboard checklist, and it certainly wasn't something you'd notice while shouting through a megaphone. It required sustained, deep observation.
And her quiet intervention to redesign that lifting protocol led to a 27% reduction in injuries over the next quarter. She saw the pattern that the loud people missed because her brain was wired to look for nuance.
Right. There's also a massive strategic advantage to operating outside the spotlight. The entrepreneur Justin Welsh talks about the power of being underestimated. When people expect less from you, or they simply don't notice you because you aren't dominating the conversation, it removes a massive amount of pressure.
You can navigate without 1,000 pairs of eyes scrutinizing your every move.
Yeah.
You innovate in silence, and by the time the loud competitors catch on to what you're doing, you're already miles ahead.
Exactly. Now, we've painted this stark, almost biological wall between the loud and the quiet. But practically, human nature is rarely that rigid, you know? Nobody is just one or the other all the time.
Right. I know I have days where I want to host a huge dinner party, and days where I want to hide in a cave with my phone on airplane mode. How does the biology explain the middle ground?
So introversion and extroversion exist on a spectrum, and sitting right in the middle are the ambiverts. Ambiverts have a flexible neurochemical response. They can lean into either trait, depending on the situation.
Okay.
And from a pure performance standpoint, they are incredibly effective. A 2013 study published in Psychological Science looked at call center employees to measure sales revenue.
I love this stat. So the extreme introverts and the extreme extroverts both generated about $138 per hour in revenue. It's basically a tie.
Right.
But the ambiverts,
Yeah.
they generated $208 per hour. It proves that cognitive and social adaptability pays off immensely. They knew when to push and pitch, and they knew when to shut up and listen to the customer.
It's a huge advantage. But what if you aren't an ambivert? What if you are a strong introvert whose dopamine receptors get completely fried after an hour of networking? How do you survive in a loud world without completely burning out?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Well, Dr. Brian Little introduced a brilliant concept called free trait theory. This theory explains that while we are born with fixed biological traits, we are entirely capable of acting out of character for the sake of core personal projects.
Meaning things we are deeply personally passionate about.
Exactly. An introvert can absolutely get up on stage and deliver a wildly charismatic, extroverted keynote speech if it's about a topic they deeply care about, or if it's necessary to support their team or their family. You can override your biology temporarily.
So if you're an introvert, you don't have to fake it forever. You can turn on the extrovert charm for that big presentation.
Yeah.
But there's a biological cost to doing that, isn't there?
A very significant one. Dr. Little calls it neurological debt. The cost of utilizing free trait theory is that introverts absolutely must schedule what he calls restorative niches.
Restorative niches.
Yes. These are physical places or dedicated blocks of time designed purely for recovery to let your acetylcholine system take over and calm your nervous system back down to baseline.
And the ultimate example of a restorative niche has to be Bill Gates' Think Week. The sources detail how once a year, he takes a 7-day solo digital detox. He goes completely off the grid to a cabin in the woods.
No emails, no meetings.
Right. No extroverted demands whatsoever, just pure deep reading and thinking. And historically, some of Microsoft's biggest, most lucrative strategic pivots came out of those silent weeks.
It's an incredible practice,
Yeah.
but it also raises an important question for the rest of us, you know? It's great that a billionaire CEO can take a week in a private cabin, but how can modern, everyday workplaces formally integrate restorative niches into their culture so introverts don't have to hide their biological need for quiet?
Well, forward-thinking companies are starting to do things like implement strict no-meeting days or create dedicated quiet zones in the office where talking is literally not allowed.
That's a great start.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that downtime isn't wasted time. It's the required fuel for deep cognitive work.
Absolutely. It requires a culture shift.
Yeah.
Management has to understand that when an employee blocks out their calendar for 2 hours of uninterrupted solo work, they aren't being antisocial. They're doing exactly what their brain needs to produce high-level innovation.
So we've covered a massive amount of ground today. Let's quickly recap the journey we've been on. First, your reaction to a loud, chaotic room isn't a personality flaw or a sign of weakness. It is literally just neurochemistry, the balance of your dopamine receptors versus acetylcholine.
Right.
Second, the extrovert ideal that tells us we have to be loud to be valuable is a relatively recent cultural invention born from urbanization and the rise of the salesman. It is not a biologically superior state of being.
And finally, the hard performance data proves that quiet leadership, deep listening, and restorative solitude actually drive massive long-term success. Introverted leaders routinely outperform loud, command and control styles in proactive, complex environments because they curate intelligence rather than dictating it.
So what does this all mean for you? If you are someone who naturally leans quiet, it means it is time to stop masking your natural traits. Stop apologizing for needing time to think before you speak.
Absolutely.
Lean into your deep focus abilities. View your quietness not as a lack of confidence or a failure to speak up, but as a highly calibrated strategic superpower.
I love that. And I want to leave you with one final, broader thought to ponder. We noted earlier that introversion is roughly 50% heritable, meaning it's literally coded into our DNA.
Right.
Furthermore, both introverted and extroverted traits exist as survival strategies across almost the entire animal kingdom. If nature has preserved this trait so carefully over millions of years, consider the evolutionary purpose of the introvert in early human history.
Wow, going all the way back to our hunter-gatherer days.
Yeah, think about the dynamic. The highly extroverted individuals, constantly seeking that dopamine reward, were likely the ones taking massive risks. They were the ones charging ahead to explore new, potentially dangerous territories or hunt larger prey.
Without them, humanity might never have expanded across the globe.
True. But it was almost certainly the highly reactive, observant introverts who stayed vigilant. Because their brains were wired to process deep stimulation and notice subtle deviations, they were the ones who noticed the changing patterns in the seasons.
Oh, wow.
They remembered which plants were poisonous. They carefully mapped out the safest routes for the tribe. Without the extroverts taking risks, we wouldn't have expanded. But without the introverts quietly observing and planning, humanity likely wouldn't have survived at all.
That is an incredible way to look at it. So the next time you find yourself at one of those exhausting networking events, feeling completely drained and wishing you could just slip out the back door, remember this. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It's keeping the tribe safe.
And there is immense power in that quiet safety.